I should warn you, this story makes me sound unreliable. In a small town, that's a permanent condition. People remember what car you drive, what time you get home. Strange things attached to names and don't wash off. I was 32 when it happened, living alone in a rental, working at a packaging warehouse. My life was steady in a way that probably sounds dull, and I was fine with that. Winter kept me indoors mostly. It gets dark early, and the cold settles into the walls of older houses. Mine was a single-floor place with low ceilings and a narrow hallway running from the living room to 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. The kitchen sat off to the side, with a back door that opened onto a yard without a proper fence, something I always meant to fix. The heating was old but functional, and after it shut off, it made a ticking sound, like it was cooling in stages. I thought for a while that noise had something to do with what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself. The living room had one large front window facing the street. I kept the blinds half down at night, not fully closed. It was January, cold enough that the air inside felt dry even with the heat running. That evening, I came home around 4, microwaved leftovers, watched television I can't remember, and texted my sister. Nothing strange, no bad mood, no headache. I don't drink during the week, and I want to state that plainly because people always ask. That night, I'd had nothing except coffee and water. Around 9, I turned off the TV and washed my plate. Winter is quiet here. Even the neighborhood dogs go silent. The smell arrived in the kitchen gradually, or at least that's how I remember it. Sweet but not sugary, not like cookies. More like perfume, but softer, almost warm. It reminded me of the old-fashioned powder my grandmother kept in her bathroom cabinet, but fresher. I didn't panic. I actually smiled. I assumed a neighbor was burning a candle and the scent had drifted through the vents, even though the houses aren't particularly close, and that doesn't quite make sense. I stood there a moment, just breathing it in. Then I heard something I still struggle to describe without sounding unhinged. It wasn't someone shouting from another room. It was more like the suggestion of a voice, close to my ear but external. A woman's voice, soft, like I'd walked into the middle of a conversation already underway. I couldn't make out full sentences. I caught fragments, or maybe I only think I did. It felt like someone saying my name in a tone that wasn't urgent, just familiar. I'm not even certain it was my name anymore. At the time, I had no doubt. I turned around immediately. The kitchen was empty. The smell seemed stronger, as if it had followed me when I moved. I walked slowly down the hallway, which isn't like me. I'm not the type to creep around my own house. I switched on the bedroom lights one by one. Nothing out of place. Windows closed, doors locked. I checked the bathroom, even pulled back the shower curtain, which I never do unless I'm actually about to shower. The voice didn't repeat itself clearly, but a low murmur persisted, like someone talking in the next room with the door shut. I was confused more than frightened. I kept looking for a practical explanation. Maybe the TV had switched back on. Maybe my phone was playing something. I checked both. TV off, phone silent on the coffee table. By then, the smell had filled the living room completely. It felt deliberate, and I know that sounds like I'm assigning intention to it. I'm not trying to. I only mean it wasn't faint anymore. It was strong enough to taste. Here is where things stop lining up. I remember picking up my car keys from the dish by the door. I remember thinking I needed fresh air, that the air inside felt too thick. That's all. I didn't feel compelled or forced. I just felt like I needed to step out. I put on my coat. I didn't put on gloves, which is strange. It was below freezing, and I'm normally careful about that. I don't remember locking the door behind me, though my sister confirmed later that it was locked when she checked. After that, nothing. No memory of walking to the car, no memory of starting it or driving. It isn't blurry, it's simply absent, like a section of tape cut cleanly out. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes to trees through my windshield. Still dark, but the angle of the streetlights was different. My car was parked on the shoulder of Route 17, where the highway curves near the woods. Engine off, keys in the ignition, turned back, seatbelt still on. I was slumped slightly to one side, and my first clear sensation was the cold. The interior of the car felt like a freezer. My breath fogged immediately. My nose was wet. I wiped it with the back of my hand and saw blood, dried in a thin line down to my lip. I tasted metal. My head didn't ache sharply. It was more like pressure behind the eyes. I didn't feel as though I'd been hit. The dashboard clock read 1:17 a.m. I had left the house around 9:30, 4 hours give or take. There were headlights behind me. A state trooper. Someone had called in a vehicle parked oddly on the shoulder. The officer kept his voice level, like he was trying not to startle me. He asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. He asked if I'd hit my head. I said I didn't think so. I told him the truth. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. I could see in his expression that he thought I was either lying or confused in a way that might become a larger problem. They took me to the hospital as a precaution. Blood sugar normal, no alcohol, no drugs. CT scan clear. The nosebleed had stopped on its own, and the doctor said cold air can trigger that, especially if the nasal lining is dry. He suggested I might have had a brief fainting spell or some kind of transient episode. That word, episode, the way he used it as a catch-all. When my sister picked me up, she kept looking at my face like she was searching for something different in it. I didn't feel different. I felt embarrassed. I kept apologizing for scaring her. She asked why I had driven all the way out there in the middle of the night. I told her about the smell and the voice, and even as I said it, I heard how it sounded. She didn't dismiss me. She nodded and said, "Maybe stress can do strange things." The police checked the area where my car had been found. No signs of anyone else nearby. No footprints in the snow near my doors except my own, from when I'd climbed out after waking up. The woods were untouched, just a thin layer of snow catching the headlights. People in town talked about it for a week or two. Sleepwalking came up, even though I've never done that. Seizures were hinted at. I had follow-up tests done. MRI normal. The neurologist told me the brain sometimes misfires in ways we don't fully understand. A few days later, I went back to the house. I stood in the kitchen where it had started, half expecting the smell to return, like it had been waiting. It didn't. The house felt ordinary. I checked under the sink for leaks or chemicals that might have caused some kind of reaction. I asked neighbors whether they'd burned candles or done anything unusual that night. No one had noticed anything strange. What bothers me most isn't the missing time. It's how calm I felt before I left. I wasn't panicked, wasn't confused. I felt almost invited. That's not quite the right word, but it's the closest I have. Like I'd been gently directed somewhere. I don't like saying that because it implies intention, and I have no proof of that. I try to stay with the facts. The smell had no clear source. I heard a voice I couldn't identify. I ended up parked near the woods with 4 hours gone and a nosebleed. That's all I can say for certain. It's been 5 years. I've never had another blackout. No one found an explanation that fit cleanly. The cabin wasn't somewhere remote or deep in wilderness, the way people picture when they hear that word. It was about 20 minutes outside the town where I grew up. Scattered houses out that way, some hunting properties, gravel roads that eventually stretched long enough between clearings that you could go a while without seeing anyone. The cabin had belonged to my uncle for years. After he moved out of state, the family shared it loosely. People used it for hunting season or to get away for a weekend. I'd been there plenty of times growing up, mostly during the day. That particular night, I was alone. I was 23 or 24, around that time. I'd just returned to town after working out of state for a while. A friend had suggested going up there to unwind. He backed out last minute because of work, but I already had the key and figured I'd go anyway. Being alone in the woods didn't bother me. Where I grew up, that was ordinary. I arrived in the early evening. The drive was exactly as I remembered. Occasional clearings where people had cut timber years ago. The trees closing back in on either side. The cabin sat in a small open patch with woods wrapping around 3 sides and a dirt driveway curving in front. I unlocked the door, brought in a cooler and a small bag, and did the usual things you do when you arrive somewhere as dark as coming. Checked the lights, confirmed the generator switch worked, opened a couple of windows because the inside smelled stale from sitting unused. For a few hours, I sat on the porch, watched the sky go dark, and listened to insects and frogs from the marshy area down the hill. At some point, I heated something quick on the stove and ate inside because the mosquitoes were getting aggressive. It was quieter than I expected. I stepped outside with a flashlight because I'd forgotten something in my truck. The cabin has no proper outdoor lighting, except one dim bulb above the door, so I always bring a small torch. As I walked down the short path toward the driveway, I heard what sounded like metal scraping dirt. The closest comparison I can make, like someone pushing something into the ground repeatedly. There's a large oak tree about 30 yards from the porch, slightly downhill toward the tree line. It's been there forever, standing apart from the rest of the trees that cluster farther back. The sound was coming from that direction. I wasn't sure I should look. That probably sounds odd, but when you're somewhere quiet at night and suddenly realize another person might be out there, it catches you off guard in a specific way. Eventually, curiosity won, and I raised the flashlight. I caught movement first. Then the beam found a figure crouched near the base of the oak, digging into the ground with what looked like a shovel or a short spade. I couldn't see the tool itself, but the sound of metal hitting dirt came every few seconds. He wasn't using a proper light. He had a phone on the ground beside him, flashlight side up, its screen casting a sideways glow across the soil. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. He wasn't wearing a shirt. The temperature had dropped by then, late enough that most people wouldn't be out there like that. He was digging in a way that looked rushed, almost frantic. Without really thinking, I raised my flashlight and pointed it directly at him. The beam hit his back and shoulders, and he froze. The sudden stillness shifted the phone on the ground, casting a strange sideways shadow across the hole he'd been digging. I remember how pale his skin looked in the light, and that his hands and forearms appeared darker, covered in something, dirt or something else. There was material smeared across his hands. I'm certain of that. Then he ran, fast, straight into the darker tree line behind the oak. He didn't grab the phone. I remember the screen staying on the ground for a moment after he disappeared, still shining sideways across the dirt. A few seconds later, he rushed back, snatched it up, and vanished into the woods again. The whole thing lasted less than 10 seconds. Something about his hands, when the light hit them, they looked wet, darkened in patches. At the time, I thought it might be blood. I can't say that with certainty. It could have been mud, but it didn't look like ordinary dirt. After a while, I walked slowly toward the oak tree. Part of me kept saying not to, but I went anyway. The ground near the base had been heavily disturbed. The hole was larger than it had seemed from a distance, roughly the length of a person lying down, perhaps a little longer, and narrow. That comparison crept into my mind on its own, whether I wanted it or not. The soil around it was piled in loose clumps, the work of someone moving quickly. I shone my light down into it. The hole was deeper than I expected, though I didn't measure it. Nothing inside caught my attention, just dirt walls and darker soil near the bottom. Standing beside it gave me a feeling I can't explain well. It wasn't simply that someone had been digging on the property. It was how he'd run, and the fact that he'd been working there alone, in the dark, with only a phone for light. Whatever he was doing wasn't meant to be seen. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door. Then the back door, which I don't usually bother with when I'm out there alone. I checked the windows too. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself with my phone and the rest of the food I'd brought, but I kept listening for sounds outside. Around midnight, possibly a little after, I had most of the lights off and was sitting near the small table by the window. A shape stopped directly in front of the glass. Someone was standing there. The cabin windows aren't large, but they're low enough that a person standing close comes to face level with whoever is inside. I couldn't make out features. The outside was darker than the room, but I could see the outline of a head and shoulders. The person leaned slightly forward, the way someone does when they're trying to look through glass. I stayed completely still. My phone screen dimmed in my hand because I'd stopped touching it, and the room got darker. For several seconds, the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, close enough that it could probably see inside if the light caught the right angle. Then it stepped back. Footsteps crossed the porch boards, moving slowly toward the front door. The handle rattled, tested, the way someone checks whether something is locked. The footsteps moved away from the door and circled around the side of the cabin. I heard gravel crunching, then faint sounds near the back door. That handle moved too. I kept my eyes on the floor. I didn't want my silhouette visible in the windows. For several minutes, the person walked the perimeter. The boards creaked occasionally. Once, something brushed the wall near the corner. Then the sounds faded gradually toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Occasionally, I thought I heard distant movement outside, though it might have been animals. When morning finally lightened the windows, I felt steady enough to start packing. I didn't bother with breakfast. Before I left, I walked back to the oak tree. The hole was still there, mostly unchanged, though some of the loose dirt had been pushed partially back in, as if someone had started filling it and then quit. The edges were uneven, like the job had been abandoned halfway. I shone my flashlight inside even though daylight was filtering through the trees by then. Nothing visible, just disturbed ground. The whole situation had the feeling of something unfinished, a piece missing I couldn't locate. I got in the truck and drove away. A couple of family members heard the story later and suggested maybe it was a hunter burying animal remains. That explanation never quite settled for me, mostly because of how he'd reacted when my light hit him, and because he'd come back to the cabin after midnight. I was 16 when this happened. My sister Alina was younger, a gap that probably shapes how I remember things. We lived in a 2-story house. My father worked, my mother stayed home and did tailoring for neighbors. We'd been in that house for about 3 years. Nothing dramatic had ever occurred there before. It wasn't old in a haunted-looking way, just beige walls, tiled floors downstairs, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a hallway that always felt darker than it should have, even in the daytime. I want to be clear that I thought that about the hallway long before anything happened. Dad left at 6:30 every morning and returned around 5. Mom would make breakfast, clean, sew. I walked Alina to the bus stop before catching mine from the next corner. Alina was small for her age and quiet. She liked drawing animals with enormous eyes, and she slept with the same faded yellow blanket she'd had since she was a baby. People asked later whether she'd changed before things started, became withdrawn, angry, started talking about imaginary friends. She hadn't. She was clingy in the ordinary way younger siblings are when they think you're more interesting than you are. The small things were easy to dismiss. The dining room lights flickered, but the wiring in that house wasn't perfect. Dad said it was loose connections and opened the switch panel one weekend. I remember him kneeling there with a screwdriver while Alina hovered too close, and he kept telling her to step back. The flickering stopped for a few days afterward, which felt like confirmation that it had been nothing. Then it started again. This time it spread. The hallway light would blink on and off slowly, like someone tapping the switch. My mother kept our bedroom doors closed at night, something about privacy and airflow. A few mornings in a row, I woke to find mine open. I assumed I'd left it that way in my sleep. Then Alina said hers had been open too, and she was strict about closing it because she was afraid of the dark. I told her she'd probably forgotten. She got defensive, which wasn't like her. She said she remembered the click of the latch. I thought it was odd that she'd paid attention to that specific detail. My mother began to look tired. She would stand in the kitchen staring at the stove as though trying to remember what she'd been about to do. One afternoon, I came home early. School was closed for some reason I can't recall, and found her at the table, holding the phone without dialing, just holding it. She said she'd heard footsteps upstairs while she was alone in the house, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. She'd gone up to check and found nothing. Windows closed, no sign of anyone. Dad didn't like that kind of talk. Houses make noise, he said. Wood expands, pipes shift. He was practical, and I think he felt that admitting something else might be happening would mean he'd failed to protect us. But when the kitchen cabinet door slammed shut on its own, hard enough to rattle the plates on the table, while all 4 of us were sitting there, he went quiet. Alina flinched so badly she knocked over her glass of water. My mother suggested having a priest come to bless the house. We weren't deeply religious, but we'd grown up attending church on holidays and important occasions, so calling one didn't feel out of place. She contacted the local parish, and a priest agreed to come on a Saturday afternoon. I was embarrassed by the whole thing, worried the neighbors would see and think we'd lost our minds. I stayed upstairs while he was there, but I could hear him murmuring prayers and moving room to room, carrying a small container of holy water he'd flick lightly against the walls. I leaned over the banister at one point and saw him in the living room, my mother standing stiffly behind him. Then they moved upstairs. He stepped into my room, then the bathroom, then Alina's room at the end of the hall. I wasn't inside, but I was close enough to see his face when he came back out. He looked different, not frightened. It was more like someone had told him something that didn't add up. His skin had gone pale. He wiped his forehead, though it wasn't warm. He asked Alina a few questions in a quiet voice, whether she'd been feeling unwell, whether she'd been having bad dreams. She nodded and looked confused. When he turned back toward the doorway of her room, he hesitated. That hesitation is what stays with me. He didn't step back inside. He turned to my parents and said he would say one more prayer downstairs. He did, quickly, and then packed his things. My mother asked if everything was all right. He said, "Continue to pray. Keep the family close." He left before sunset without completing the blessing. That night, things changed in a way that's harder to talk about. Around midnight, I woke to a heavy thud from the hallway. Not the sound of something falling, heavier than that. My door was open again, and the hallway light was on, though we'd turned it off before bed. I stepped out and saw Alina standing at the top of the stairs, swaying slightly, the way someone sways when they're sleepwalking. Her nightgown had dark stains across the front. It looked like blood. I rushed to her and grabbed her shoulders. She blinked at me slowly, as if trying to focus. My mother came running up behind me and gasped and pulled Alina into the bathroom. We checked her arms, her legs, her scalp. There was no cut, no scratch, no dried blood on her skin. The stains were only on the fabric. Dad checked the stairs, the hallway, the bathroom floor for signs of a fall. Nothing. No source. My hands were shaking as I held the edge of the sink. I've gone back over it and thought maybe I missed something obvious. Maybe she'd had a nosebleed and wiped it away. But there was nothing on her face. And the stains were lower, across her chest and stomach. We took her to the hospital anyway, because she started complaining of stomach pain. By the time we arrived, she was feverish and quiet. They kept her overnight for observation. My parents stayed with her. I went back with my uncle, who had come to help. The next morning, I went upstairs to get some clothes for my mother. Alina's room felt colder than the rest of the house. I know how that sounds, like I'm manufacturing atmosphere. I'm not. The window was closed. The air was still. Her bed was unmade from the night before, the yellow blanket half on the floor. Something was sitting on the edge of her bed. It looked like a woman, but distorted, as if the face had been stretched unevenly in different directions. The mouth seemed too wide, the eyes didn't align correctly, like something slightly blurred. But I knew it wasn't a shadow. It was darker than the room and somehow separate from it. I froze. It turned its head toward me. The movement was wrong, like a video running at the wrong speed. I felt heavy pressure in my chest. Then it was gone. I even stepped closer to the bed, like I might catch it doing something again. Eventually, I grabbed the clothes I'd come for and left, pulling the door shut behind me harder than I meant to. Alina was discharged 2 days later. Her fever had broken. The doctors found nothing seriously wrong. She seemed tired, but otherwise normal for about a week. Then she got sick again, and this time it was worse. She woke up screaming about a woman sitting on her bed, watching her sleep. My parents exchanged a look that I still think about. She developed bruises on her arms. Doctors suggested she might have been bumping into things, but the location of them didn't make sense. They were clustered in a way that felt deliberate. I don't want to overstate that, but they were. My parents began looking for another house almost immediately. They didn't discuss it openly, but I could hear the conversations through the thin walls at night. We moved out within a few months. It felt rushed. Some furniture was left behind because there hadn't been time to sell it. Alina improved after we moved, gradually. The fever stopped. She slept through the night again. The bruises faded and didn't come back. We never spoke about the distorted woman. I tried once, and my mother told me not to fill my head with things that weren't helpful. Dad said stress can make you see things. I've driven past that house a few times over the years. It's still standing, but no one lives there. The yard is overgrown, the windows boarded. I don't know if that's connected to what happened or simply because the market is bad. Houses get abandoned all the time. I try not to make it into something symbolic. Alina is in her late 20s now. She doesn't remember much about that year, only that she felt watched. Sometimes she jokes about being the haunted child of the family, but lightly, like she's testing how serious it really was. What I replay most isn't the figure on the bed. It's the priest's face when he stepped out of her room. The way he didn't go back in. A grown man deciding not to continue. Whatever was in that house, if it was something at all and not simply our minds under pressure, seemed to grow angrier after that day. I don't have an explanation for the blood on her nightgown or the thing I saw sitting on the edge of her bed. I'm not sure I'm meant to.